Welcome to the Wild Photographer, friends. I've got another episode back by popular demand, a topic that I'll be honest is pretty critical in the world of photography. Is understanding your camera's settings. And I will be the first to admit that camera settings can seem very, very complicated. Even to me in this day and age, I sometimes struggle with these little mini computers or actually very large computers that are in some of these cameras we have today. And what we're finding is that these menu systems are so deep, they're getting more advanced, they're getting more complicated, that it's getting harder and harder to really understand and especially to make use of all the things that your camera offers. Now, I will of course advocate that you learn as much as you possibly can, but today's episode is a way of distilling this down into the 5 most useful camera settings, what they are, and how to use them. So in today's episode, we're talking about these 5 key settings. They are going to be your drive motor. They're going to be your exposure compensation, your autofocus zone, your autofocus type, and your white balance. Now, this is not to say that all the other fancy camera settings are not important or you can skip over them entirely, but these are no doubt the 5 most important to expand your prowess in photography, expand your creativity in photography, and very likely turn your photos from good to great or great to excellent and beyond. So if you can master these 5 settings, know what they are, and know how to use them, you're going to elevate your photography in a big, big way in very little time. A couple quick housekeeping things before we get going in today's episode. I want to remind you of a new segment I'm adding to the podcast, and that is listener questions. In fact, we have our first listener question later on in today's episode, and these are questions that are submitted by you in the audience via my Gmail, via my email, or by leaving a YouTube comment. So I'll remind you again at the end of the episode if you would like to do one or the other of those. But if you'd like to submit your own question and have them answered on air, you can do so by emailing me at wildphotographer.podcast@gmail.com. Or you can head on over to my YouTube channel. That's just Court Whalen on YouTube. Leave a comment on any of my podcast videos. I will see them and I will answer them in an upcoming episode. It's a great way to get your questions answered by yours truly. Happy to do it. And last but not least, shout out to the sponsor of Wild Photographer Podcast, LensRentals.com, a tremendous resource for trying out gear, getting gear like primo lenses for a short amount of time. You can either try them at home or try them on your next photo adventure. It's a really, really great way to experiment and to test lenses before you buy them. That's kind of what I use them mostly for. But if you're heading on a big safari and want to get one of those big 300 primes, 400 primes, you're headed to Borneo on a photo expedition and want to try out one of these super telephoto zooms, Lens Rentals has just about everything you could possibly imagine and more for all camera platforms out there. So lensrentals.com. If you use the promo code WildPhotographer15, you will get 15% off. So thanks to Lens Rentals for doing that, and thanks for sponsoring the show. Big appreciation there. Without further ado, let's get into the episode. So the first thing up is drive motor. Now, this is also the time to say that each camera manufacturer, every platform, whether it's Canon, Sony, Nikon, Pentax, Olympus, they're all going to have slightly different terms for these things. So my job is to define these terms such that if your camera manufacturer doesn't use the exact same verbiage, you at least know what I'm talking about and you can find it in your camera's system or menu. But in reality, these are the ubiquitous terms. These are the ones that the big 4 camera manufacturers are using. So you shouldn't have too much trouble finding exactly what these things truly mean. So drive motor, the first one, this is basically a way of saying how many photos does your camera take when you press down the shutter. And you might think if you're just starting off photography, well, it's going to take as many as it can. It's going to take the maximum. That is simply not true. You need to set your own drive motor, how many photos it takes in succession as you hold that shutter button down. And this is really important because when you take your camera out of the box, it's going to have a very medium setting. This goes for point and shoots all the way up to the biggest, fanciest DSLR and mirrorless cameras. If your camera can shoot 15 frames a second, which is on the high end, it is probably not set to that by default. So if you're on a wildlife photo trip and you want to take 10 photos per second of that lion yawning or really anything else of wildlife behavior, which I absolutely advocate for, you need to know how to set your drive motor appropriately. Now, the reason that we don't automatically put it on the highest frame per second, i.e. FPS, is because we don't always want to take the maximum number of photos per second. For landscape photography, great example. I don't want to accidentally take 4 photos of the exact same scene on the same settings. Now, I might take 4 photos of a beautiful mountain scene, but I'm going to do it with different creative angles. I'm going to do it with different shutter speeds or different apertures, different ISOs. I don't want 4 of the exact same. So by default, when I'm walking around, if I'm not in front of wildlife or not expecting big wildlife action, I am going to keep it on a medium or slow frame per second rate. However, I want to know exactly where it's at in my camera. It's usually very easy to find. And I also want to know where to set it based on the action I'm likely to see. Most cameras out there are going to be somewhere in the range of 3 to 15 photos per second, or frames per second, FPS. And your drive motor is entirely in charge of that setting. You're also going to see in your drive motor a couple other settings. You're going to see a 2-second timer, which I advocate for landscape photography, because it allows you to hit the shutter button and then let the camera stabilize a little bit for 2 seconds, meaning you're not moving the camera, pushing the button, jarring it slightly before it takes that photo. It's a huge, huge advantage for things like aurora photography and landscape photography when you don't have a remote shutter release. In fact, I never carry a remote shutter release anymore because I just have a 2-second timer. That's under your drive motor. If you want to take photos of friends and family and you're behind the lens and you want to run up and stand next to them, you can put it on the 10-second timer. These are pretty familiar things. We have them on our smartphones. We've had them on cameras since really the dawn of time. But it's important to understand it's all part of the same menu system. You're probably going to see 2, 3, maybe 4 other settings that talk about the variability of speed of frames per second. Remember, we're trying to balance that, not taking too many photos every time you press the shutter, because these things are hair triggers. If you're on like a 20 frame per second and you just tap your shutter once and let go of it, you might think you're only taking 1 photo, but I guarantee you when you look back and review your photos, you're going to see 5 photos of the exact same thing. This is bad for a couple of reasons. It's going to eat up your memory card. It's going to be a lot to go through and call. It is even going to drain your battery unnecessarily. So we want to be judicious with exactly how fast or slow. But again, getting a handle on your specific make and model of camera, of where those settings are, so you can dial it in appropriately each and every time. We might start off the day with a 3 frame per second, or a sort of normal rate, what would be like a slow continuous drive motor. But then when we're out on a game drive in Safari, or we're in front of big brown bears in Alaska, we might quickly go up to a fast frame per second. And then when the action's really going, we might dial up to a fast plus. This is what my camera has. I'm on a Canon system. It's a little, high frame rate with an H with a plus on it. And believe it or not, I can take something like 15 to 20 frames a second. And this is extraordinarily valuable when we're in front of wildlife. When you're looking back on your photos and you have change of behavior, this is when you do want to have variability. You do want to have 20 frames to cull through. You want to look to see, well, which one of these 20 shots in that 1 second of behavior is the bear looking right back at me? Which one is the one where the salmon is leaping right in the mouth of the brown bear? Or any number of examples that we have around the world in the realm of wildlife photography. So this is not to say that there's a perfect drive setting for your exact next photo, but there is this range. You want to know how to use it, study your drive motor, get very used to dialing it in and changing it, be able to do it maybe, dare I say, without even looking at your camera's menu. I have a custom button on my camera where I can toggle it to go faster and faster. If I push one button, it just ramps up that shutter motor to 1 notch faster, 1 notch faster, 1 notch faster, until it goes back around to the slow. Now, if I'm ending my day doing wildlife photography, yes, I do deliberately go back and put it on my quote unquote walking around setting. But the key thing is to get really, really used to changing it, know where it is, and then also know how to use it. The best way to learn how to use it, of course, is going to be to practice. Your camera is probably not identical to mine. Make and models, even from year to year, version to version, can differ. In fact, frame rate is one of the quickest growing or most innovative parts of camera tech, especially in the mid to high end camera range these days. So even though I'm on an R5 Mark I, I guarantee you the next one has an even faster frame rate. And when the next one comes out, or whatever new version of your camera comes out, it's going to be higher. So adapting to that, knowing how to use it, super, super important. The next one is exposure compensation. Now, this is a highly, highly valuable setting for everybody but those people that shoot on full manual. I know there are a few of you out there. I myself am actually not a full manual user. If you go back to listen to one of my previous episodes for my go-to mode for all photography, not just wildlife, but also landscapes, you'll know that I have a manual plus auto ISO. I choose everything but let the camera choose ISO. This means I still get to use exposure compensation. Well, let's go back and say what it is. Exposure compensation is a dial that allows you to let in more or less light into your photo to lighten or darken the shot. So what this means is if I'm in the rainforest or wherever I might be, and I notice that my photos are too bright and I want to dim them out a little bit because it's blowing out the highlights or it's not exposing the subject or the mountain range properly, instead of fumbling around with my shutter speed and ISO combinations, I can go to this exposure compensation and quickly dial this into thirds of increments, lighter or darker. So this is a really, really great thing, once again, to get to know very, very intimately on your camera. Now, this is where I can tell you a little bit more about where this exists on your camera. Very likely, very usually, you will find a little plus or minus button somewhere on the back of your camera. One of the actual buttons on your camera will allow you to modify this. Sometimes you have to look on your camera screen, especially with the newer cameras. They still have plentiful buttons, but oftentimes there are so many custom things they will allow you to do that has been relegated to just the touch screen. Nevertheless, it's a super helpful tool. I will give you a quick pro tip. If you are able to customize this to a button on the back of your camera, it does do heaps of good. In fact, Canon's new system of all their RF or their mirrorless lenses will actually have an extra dial on the lens itself. It doesn't dial focus, it doesn't dial aperture. It is a custom dial that you can go into your camera and tell your camera what you want it to change. And I have all my custom dials set to exposure compensation. That way, with one hand on my lens, usually my left hand, I can actually quickly dial left or right to darken or lighten my photo. This is huge. It is a massive, massive game changer. You might be asking yourself or asking me, well, can't I change exposure in my Photoshop program or in my workflow for post-processing? Yes, you can, but you will always want to get your photo as right as possible in camera. So when you do inevitably need to make adjustments, you're only making small, minor adjustments and not changing the lighting scheme significantly. So exposure compensation is a way to tell your camera quickly and easily to lighten or darken the photo. Now, again, going back to the reason behind all this, these cameras have brilliant little mini computers in them, and they get the exposure right 60, 70% of the time, but that's not all the time. And they definitely don't get it right if you're trying to do something really creative with your controls. The way cameras usually expose and choose the lighting scheme for your photo is based on a very digital calculation. It's trying to figure out how can I, not me the photographer, but me the camera, how can I make the average light of all pixels 18% pure gray? Now, don't read into that terminology too much. Don't read into that concept too much. But the idea is that your camera is just using a very, very computerized scheme to figure out, is your photo light or dark enough? You, the photographer, you, the creative, have that ability to go in and do something different, do something wild, do something really interesting with your photo, or simply just correct it if the camera didn't get it right in the first place. So exposure compensation is a spectacular tool to know in your camera's menu system. The next one the next two have to do with autofocus. Yes, 2 out of the 5, it's that important. Autofocus, to be totally frank, other than filmmakers and cinematographers out there using DSLRs and mirrorless, I don't know a lot of photographers using full manual focus all that often. I might use it when I'm doing night photography or astrophotography, northern lights photography, when I can just take all the time in the world to set things up. If I'm really just focusing, pun intended, if I'm really concentrating on something like landscape photography where nothing's moving, okay, fine, maybe I'll put it on manual. But to be honest, why would I do that when I can take 4 photos in the time of 1 by using autofocus? So that's just a quick aside to say, yes, autofocus is still very, very important, even for the most pro photographers out there that are making their living day to day with photography. But the first thing with autofocus I want to tell you about is the autofocus zone. So this is with autofocus on, of course. Your camera, no matter how simple or advanced it is, probably has somewhere between 4 to 6 autofocus zones. I'm going to tell you right now that there's really only 2 zones to think about, in my opinion. But let me talk about the range of zones, just like I talked about the range of drive motor settings. So it's essentially a spectrum going from an entire full frame, meaning your entire screen, your entire sensor zone, allowing your camera to choose what it thinks it should focus on in the entire frame. Notice I'm saying that with a little bit of skepticism in my voice, all the way down to the other end of the spectrum, which means that it's only the dead middle of your frame each and every time. Your autofocus zone is one little square in the middle versus giving your camera the leeway to choose all 64 or 96 squares of that size in your frame. In between all that, there's essentially variations on how close to the middle does your camera still have the choice to set your autofocus zone. So the reason I say there's really only 2 zones in that spectrum to consider is that I am extremely biased in that I think that every photographer should immediately, without reserve, without basically ever changing, set their autofocus zone on the dead middle of their frame so that that box never moves. I definitely do not want my camera choosing what it thinks I should focus on. There might be some wisp of grass. I might be photographing a tiger deep in the bush, and the branches and the trees will confuse my camera. I mean, I can't tell you how many times this happens to me that the camera is constantly trying to pick an autofocus zone. If you've ever tried to photograph a small bird in a forest, you know exactly what I'm talking about. The camera chooses something it thinks might be worthy of focusing on, but very rarely, especially when you have small wildlife, small critters, or very specific things you're trying to photograph, very rarely does it get it right. So I highly advocate going away from that full frame autofocus zone. Only go for that dead middle pinpoint autofocus. Then for just about all my shots, I hold the shutter down halfway, focus on that thing in the dead middle of my frame. It's the easiest way to find that thing and put it in my frame and lock it into focus is if I rely on it being in the middle. But holding that shutter down halfway allows me to then recompose my shot and adhere to something more like the rule of thirds, use a leading line, using the phi grid, using Fibonacci spiral, one of these other advanced compositional techniques using this method. Now, like all things, I think you should learn a little bit and practice and experiment. So try cycling through your autofocus zones, but you'll find that it really is a very, very obvious difference if you have it on the dead middle pinpoint. The only time, and this is a very clear exception to make, is when I am handing my camera off to someone that may not be familiar with my camera. Maybe they're a photographer, they just don't know the Canon system, or maybe it's someone at a restaurant or a friend or family. I'm like trying to get a photo of me in front of a waterfall or something, and it's pretty clear that I'm the only subject. I will quickly put it on that full frame autofocus zone just so I don't have to go through the explanation I'm giving you right now of telling that person, hey, there's a little small autofocus zone in the middle of the frame. I want you to put me in that, hold the shutter halfway down, then recompose the shot so I'm on the left 2/3, leaving the space on my right-hand side. Instead, I just say, take my camera, hold the shutter, push it, and it should be good. And allowing the camera that leeway to choose what it thinks should be in focus, i.e. me, it does work pretty well. But again, when I'm the creator, when I'm behind the camera, I never want the camera to choose. So choosing your autofocus zone, knowing how to change it, not so much because we're changing it on the fly, but the key thing is that no camera comes out of the box giving you that center point autofocus. I've never seen it in my life. Whenever I'm on photo trips and I'm guiding and I'm teaching and I'm setting people's camera up for success, it's always going to be on some derivation of those other parts of the spectrum. It might be the middle third of the pixels of the frame that it allows it to autofocus, and that little focus box will jump as you press down the shutter, or it might be on the full zone. So I'm not changing on the fly. I just want to change it first and foremost to get my camera set up for great photography. And again, it might be the most obvious, most intuitive, most helpful for wildlife photography, but almost all the time that I'm photographing out in the field, landscape, cultural, you name it, travel photography, lifestyle photography, there is something in the scene that I want to focus on deliberately, and the rest of it is okay to not be in perfect focus. In fact, sometimes with advanced aperture techniques, we we take a slice of focus. So that thing that I want to focus on is even more important to be tack sharp if the rest of the scene is going to be blurred and out of focus, that beautiful, that blur, that bokeh that we often seek in pro photography. So once again, knowing to set your camera on that middle autofocus point is really, really helpful when you're out in the wild photographing in field conditions. Now, the exception I was going to make is with newer cameras, we have this technology of follow focus. Now, this is where the terminology changes markedly from Canon to Nikon to Sony to Olympus. But in today's day and age, with these mirrorless cameras, there's a technology that allows you to follow focus with just pressing the shutter down. And this is not the episode to go into gritty detail on exactly how to do that, but to know that you have a follow or a tracking autofocus is something that I do use, and that's the other time that I'll go away from these autofocus zones. Now, depending, again, on your camera make and model, it may be in your autofocus zone settings or it may be in an entirely different place. This is something that I plan on doing a future episode on, all about autofocus tracking, because it is a bit of a game changer. If you haven't heard of this or haven't upgraded your camera in a while, it's pretty extraordinary when you can push your shutter button and your autofocus point, that single square that's tracking this animal, will actually lock on to its face, or even better yet, its eye. So when that bird is soaring overhead, when the bear is running across the meadow, when the cheetah is stalking in the savannah, you don't have to continually refocus. Hold that shutter down, recompose, put it in the center, focus, hold the shutter button down, recompose. You can actually track it. And it's pretty extraordinary. It's relatively new technology, so I imagine not all of you, and maybe not even most of you in the audience, will have that in your camera. But nevertheless, it's an important thing to know, just setting you up for a future episode on all about autofocus. Now, we're not totally done with autofocus, because there's another autofocus setting that I do think is quite important. There is a setting that allows you to continually autofocus, and there is a setting that allows you to lock in focus. So I'm a huge fan of doing most of the work myself. I don't want the camera to have too much leeway. This is a theme of today's episode. I don't want to give it too much decision making, but if you do set your camera on continuous focus, what it does is as you hold that shutter button down, as the animal moves closer, well, I shouldn't say animal, it could be anything. It could be a person, it could be a train, some sort of vehicle. As that thing moves, it actually continually refocuses, as long as, big caveat, as long as you're holding the shutter down and as long as it stays in that autofocus zone, i.e. the center of your frame, if you choose my advice here, and put that autofocus zone in the middle. So continuous autofocus, another thing that often takes various different names across camera platforms. For some, it's called servo, S-E-R-V-O autofocus. For most of the other manufacturers, it's just called continuous, go figure. But the biggest thing to know is whether you are on continuous or on single, because this is one of these times where you can get really, really tripped up if you accidentally have it on a setting that you're not expecting. So going back, the times that I use continuous are pretty limited, but they're very, very important for fast moving wildlife where I don't have the time or I don't have the accuracy to continue to autofocus and know it's going to be in focus zones. So if an animal, a person is running, so we can even make the parallel into like sports. If you're photographing a kid's soccer game, a professional soccer game, having continuous autofocus is going to save you a lot of time, which translates into more photos. You have continuous autofocus with a high drive motor, and you're going to get the cover of Sports Illustrated, next edition, which is never, I think, because they close. I don't think Sports Illustrated exists anymore. But nevertheless, you get my point. You're going to get more photos, which translates to more options and probably better photos too. Okay, I'm going to test your patience here and give you a scenario where you can combine an autofocus zone with the autofocus type to get you really, really interesting results. So if you do put on continuous autofocus and you're in an area where your subject, be it a person or an animal, is on a relatively plain background, meaning it's not a small bird in the forest with trees and leaves everywhere. It's a bear in a meadow. It's a soccer player on a soccer field. It's someone running across the grass with a mountain in the background. There's a really cool combination. Oh, and also whales breaching. This is another really, really big one. Oh, and birds in flight. Yeah, so there are a handful of examples here. You can put your autofocus zone on the middle third of your frame or the entire frame, meaning you're at the far end of the spectrum where you're letting your camera choose just about any autofocus point it wants. If you combine that with continuous autofocus, you do get really, really great results for very unpredictable behavior or very hard to track animals, like birds in flight, like whales breaching, like safari animals running, or going into the people world, sports figures playing on a field. What that does is the camera will pick out the focus point itself. Again, it's not going to be perfect, but it's going to be good enough because then you will use the continuous autofocus. And as you hold that shutter down, it's going to basically be like tracking that thing, that subject across the field, tracking that subject across the savannah, tracking that subject across the mountain range. This is really, really interesting. It's really, really helpful. I will tell you that it kind of flies in the face of the new autofocus tracking feature I just mentioned, but that was kind of like the old school way of doing autofocus tracking, where you can set your camera on a full zone autofocus mixed with a continuous autofocus. And then all you've got to do is keep the subject, whether it's a bird or whatever, in your frame, keep the shutter held down, and then snap, snap, snap away. You mix that with a high drive motor, and you're probably going to get some really crisp, great shots of those few seconds of a sequence. So yeah, that's a really interesting caveat. But I'm not done yet with the autofocus type, because I do want you to be aware of the setting that I use probably 98% of the time, which is just single autofocus. What that means is that I have to hold the shutter down halfway each and every time I want it to be in focus. The downside is that if that animal or person is swiftly moving towards you or away from you, meaning it's moving in and out of the zone of focus fast, you're going to have to continuously press that shutter halfway, release it, press it halfway to refocus and refocus and refocus. But the trick is the moment it locks in focus, that's when you shoot. Okay, so the key thing here, like a couple of the other settings I've mentioned, is that the best way to use this is just to know which setting you want to be on most of the times. So it's important to know your autofocus type, and it's important to be on single shot autofocus most of the time, unless you have one of these really, really special scenarios like I just described, like the whales breaching, like the soccer game, like the animals running in and out of your plane. But again, I don't like to leave my camera up to too many decision-making abilities. So I do it myself, and with a little bit of practice, it's going to make it a lot easier and a lot more successful. The final setting I'm going to talk about today is going to be your white balance. Now, this is something that a lot of photographers will approach me with and say, how did you get that incredible orange sunset? I took the same photo and it's very blue, or it's very washed out. It's a very cold look. Yours is so warm and vibrant. Same thing with canyons photography. I might be in a beautiful slot canyon of Arizona, and the photo I took has purples and yellows and reds and oranges that the person right next to me was not getting. They were getting nothing but the upper end of the spectrum, a lot of whites and yellows and barely any oranges. This might have to do, very likely have to do, with your white balance setting. And what, again, the theme of this episode is kind of getting off a lot of these autos, is knowing that your camera by default is going to be set on some version of auto. And what auto does is, once again, let your camera make a little bit too many decisions. So white balance is basically a way of your camera perceiving what pure white really is. And the reason this is important is because pure white takes so many forms. What pure white looks like with a golden, beautiful sun at noon looks very different from a orange, even more golden sun at sunset or sunrise. What your camera perceives as pure white under a tungsten or fluorescent light bulb is very different than in natural sun. And so your camera is constantly calibrating colors. You may not know this, but your camera is choosing the color of your photos. And as you know, color is one of the most important aspects of photography. So you can let it choose, but you're going to get a lot of variability. Or maybe more importantly, you're going to get a lot of muted colors. Just by and large, I shoot on a warm white balance, which means either a shady or a cloudy white balance setting. What this does, I'm not going to get into the nuances and technicalities of what these Kelvin values mean, but it's basically trying to compensate for what I'm telling it the ambient settings might be for the day. So if I'm saying it's really, really cloudy out there, the sun through clouds tends to make things look a little bit cooler and blue. So I'm telling my camera, actually, you know what? Go ahead and add in more yellow, or perceive white in a different way, such that you're bringing out the natural yellows and oranges and reds of this scene. Conversely, I might switch to a more daylight white balance setting. And if this is the case, it's perceiving a really yellow hue coming from the sun. So it's actually going to add in more blue in my scene. And this is exactly what you're probably reading into right now. It's a spectrum from blue to yellow. If your photos look drab and uninteresting, you might want to change your white balance setting. There are some rules that when you're in kind of warm, yellowy, orangey kind of places, like in front of sunsets or sunrises, or if you're in canyons, areas with beautiful red rocks, you might want to shoot on a warm white balance. If you're in a tropical jungle and you want to imbue that sense of heat and humidity in your photo, like so many experiences in Borneo and rainforests around the world imbue to my own skin, you might want to keep it or set it on a warm white balance, like a cloudy or a shady, because you want to portray that heat in your photo. The opposite would be a cool white balance. You'll notice this is very, very similar to like warming and cooling filters back in the days of film. It's really just the same thing. So a cooling filter obviously makes your photos look a little more cool. Sometimes when we shoot really early in the morning, we kind of want to emphasize that blue hour. We want to emphasize the coolness of the forest as we're waking up. And I will set my camera on a daylight white balance. So I'm essentially toggling between daylight and cloudy with my scenes. I'm typically toggling from trip to trip, not so much hour to hour or day to day, but I do want you to know of this creative control, which will dramatically change the look of your photos for the better once you harness it. But also just know that you might want to think about changing it indeed from location to location. A couple other examples. When I'm in the Arctic, I might be photographing polar bears or scenes in places like Churchill, Canada, and I want that snowy scene to look cooler. I want the winter wonderland of Rocky Mountain National Park to look cooler. I will tell my camera, by putting on a daylight white balance, I want you to photograph in a cooler way. And that's going to bring out the blues. It's going to saturate the blues more. And then what happens is when you go into Photoshop or Lightroom or any of these programs, you're going to be able to emphasize that even more without starting from scratch and having to basically create the whole effect yourself by changing the white balance, by oversaturating. In other words, no white balance, know where to find it. It's generally listed on your camera. A lot of point and shoots will have this as an actual button. It will be a WB. And oftentimes when you go into your camera's menu, you'll notice white balance says AWB for auto white balance. Nothing evil, nothing wrong with auto white balance. Don't let me convince you to change off of it if you're just not comfy, or you say, you know what, my photos have been great this whole time. Why should I ever change? That's fine, but just know about it. Experiment with it, see the differences. One of the best ways to experiment is with sunrises and sunsets. You get just dramatically different colors. And the whole idea is, at least for me, replicating what you see in person. That glorious orange and red sunset, if you shoot on a cool white balance, will probably turn it into something that you don't recognize. If you shoot an auto white balance, it's probably something that is too muted and not as glorious as you remember seeing in person. So harnessing that is a really, really important thing, and definitely one of my top 5 camera settings that I'm changing maybe from day to day and especially from trip to trip and area to area. All right, so we are on to the first ever listener question on the Wild Photographer podcast. Today's question comes in as, what is the difference between RAW and JPEG when shooting, and which one do you recommend for different types of photographers? This is a really, really great question. I actually do have a deeper dive episode on this. I think it was probably 10 or 15 episodes ago, but it's a really, really important one for budding photographers. Again, we're talking about what is your camera set on by default out of the box? Pretty much always JPEG. JPEG is great. We all use JPEGs. All my photos become JPEGs in the end, but I do start taking my photos with RAW. And RAW is a really, really interesting way of capturing and storing data because it is indeed more raw. There's more data. It actually collects data from your scene, not in a compressed, adjusted way like a JPEG might be. You actually notice if you shoot the same scene with a RAW and a JPEG, the JPEG looks better. It absolutely will. The RAW is a little bit more muted. There's less contrast. It's because it's actually capturing the scene in red, green, and blue pixels versus merging them together and making the best of all worlds. So the RAW, the downside is that you have to process your photos. You can't just share a RAW. You can't text message a RAW. Most phones and computer programs and websites won't even allow you to upload a RAW. So you have to process it, but the advantage comes into when you do want to process it. You have so much more creative ability. I often make an analogy of, like, say you're a music synthesizer or producer. You know, you're someone that's adjusting the volume of this symphony in front of you. It's your job to make them sound really good, right? So a JPEG, when you're changing lighting and contrast or saturation, all these very common features, common editing tools, it's like changing the volume or the pitch of the entire symphony all at once. You're changing woodwinds just as much as you are the strings and the percussion. So everything goes up, everything goes down. Whereas if you're shooting on RAW, it's more like you have creative control over those different elements, the tone, the volume, blah, 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 of each individual section. Like, oh, let's increase the strings here because this is their solo. Let's decrease the percussions here because it's a little bit overbearing. And so what that allows you to do with photography is make better adjustments that ultimately look less harsh. They will not make your photo as pixelated or as grainy or as deteriorated. You have so much more creative control. Your photo can take so much more editing, and you ultimately have a lot more data to work with. So I would say, for anybody out there that really likes photography and does any sort of editing, at very least set your camera on RAW plus JPEG. I get it. Like, not everybody has time for editing. Sometimes we get home from a trip and we just want to throw our photos on a TV for friends and family to watch over the holidays. That's great. The RAWs are going to take time. You're going to have to ultimately export them from Photoshop, from Lightroom, or whatever into a JPEG. So having a JPEG in your camera ready to go is a really, really nice thing. But if you do edit, a RAW is going to absolutely be your way to go. And let's say you actually are undecided and you don't even really know if you're ever going to get to RAWs. If you think you might ever want to edit photos, go ahead and just shoot out anyway. Why not? It's not that much more memory in reality, in all things considered. Memory is relatively cheap. We have huge terabyte drives. They're relatively inexpensive from what they used to be. I will tell you, just to be totally honest, RAWs are about 5 times, maybe even 10 times the size of a JPEG. So you don't want to do it willy-nilly without checking your memory storage capabilities. But nevertheless, doubling or tripling the size of your memory card just to enable you taking RAWs and having that ability to make your photos the very best they can be is a huge service that you are doing for yourself, and I do recommend it. All right, so that's today's episode on 5 indispensable camera settings, what they are and how to use them. I do want to encourage you to submit your own listener question if you would like. You can do so by emailing me at wildphotographer.podcast@gmail.com, or head on over to my YouTube channel and leave a comment on one of the podcast episodes. It doesn't even have to be an episode that pertains to your question. I see all the comments, and I'd be delighted to hear from you. Last but very not least, I have a relatively new newsletter that I'm sending out from my website, courtwhalen.com. That's just www.courtwhalen, COURTWHELAN.com. If you sign up, it's in the top bar. Just drop your email and I'll send you a note every week or two about new photo techniques or some of my expeditions and adventures around the world that I think you'll enjoy. So once again, thanks so much for tuning in, and we'll talk to you next time.